Of introduction. My name's Kevin. I'm a drug and alcohol worker and trainer based in London in the UK. I started off as a youth worker and have worked as a drugs worker for a long time. And at this point, I now mostly work in training. And I've been doing training for a long time. And over the years, what's happened is more and more people have been interested in looking at not just the sort of drugs awareness side of it, but there's a lot of interest about the long-term effects. We've always done a lot of physical harm reduction, like the safer injecting and the overdose prevention, but the harm reduction and awareness around the impact of substance use on mental well-being isn't as there aren't as many resources around it, and there's not as much information available. One of the problems has always felt like it's one of those subjects which has become very technical. So we tend to end up tiptoeing into the terrain of dual diagnosis really, really quickly. And that tends to mean that we end up with people sort of going, oh, I don't really know what to do with this. I need to refer it to a specialist. And that's so frustrating. So this resource that, so what happened was I've been doing stuff around drugs and brain chemistry for quite a long time. Some of that's for workers and some of that's for end users, so that they've got the tools to have some insight into their own condition as well. What I tend to find in the UK is there are a lot of drugs workers who have a passing understanding of the impact on mental health, and a lot of mental health workers who have a passing understanding of how drugs affect mental well-being. So what ends up happening is drugs workers tend to end up going, well, it's probably not very good for your mental health, and mental health workers say something similar, but there's not a lot of detailed understanding of it. Bearing in mind what Eliza was saying, there's obviously a huge benefit in going into a lot of the research, especially around NPS and things like synthetic cannabinoids and things like that. But one of the things that we needed to start with was something that was usable by young people, with young people, for young people, and that's what this resource came out of. So a few months ago, Florian said, would I be interested in writing this? I already had quite a lot of it in place from the training I was doing, hence the resource that we're using now. So this was drafted. The resource that I'm going to work through with you and show you, this was drafted, and I did the rough cut of it, and then Ruby at Youthwise and the rest of the team did a lot more of the graphics, and so we put it together. It's still a little rough. There's a few changes we'll probably make further down the line, not least in response to feedback from yourselves. So I'm going to walk you through some of the slides. What I want to explain is what the thinking behind each one is, and the bits that I want to expand on, and the bits that you'd use as discussion. And then what I'd like to do at the end of that is, yes, I'll slow down a bit. What I'd like to do at the end of that is throw it open to you all for questions and discussion. So I'll try and slow down, but thanks for the prompt, Eliza. As I say, if anybody wants to ask questions, Ruby and Florian are both there on the chat. So I'm going to try and keep an eye on just doing the presentation part of it, and I'll let Ruby and Florian deal with the chat side of it more. So I'm going to use share screen. You are all muted at the moment, but you have the power to unmute yourself whenever you wish to. So. Fab. Okay, so the idea of this presentation and the idea of the resources are intended to be, rather than being incredibly detailed and an incredibly scientific tool, they're the starting point for a number of discussions. And it's hoped that whether it's a youth worker, a drug and alcohol worker, or a worker in mental health settings, the slides will be accessible in their current state without a detailed technical knowledge around either drugs or mental health. The other bit I'm really keen on is to try and make sure that we step away from just looking at it in the context of mental illness, because what I want to recognize is that all substance use, or any use of any psychoactive substance by its very nature, has an impact on my mental function. And that might be benign, might be an advantageous impact on my mental function. It might be advantageous in the short term, might become negative in the meantime, so in the longer term. So all substance use is going to interact with mental state, and that's very much my starting point with this, rather than just looking at it as the nexus between substance use and mental illness as a diagnosed illness. So some of the questions that this is the cover slide that you can see at the moment, and some of the same questions here appear on the next slide. So the classic question, which everyone kind of comes to this with, was the chicken and egg question of, am I anxious because I'm using drugs, or am I using drugs because I'm anxious? and how do the two interact? Is my substance use a driver for my poor mental health, or is my poor mental health a driver for my substance use? A more general one, which is always interesting, is how do the drugs I use affect my brain? And while I might understand how I feel when I use drugs, I don't necessarily understand why I feel that. And one of the things I'm very keen on is to try and help people develop a sense of agency and empowerment. And part of that is understanding what's going on behind the scenes. Because if I'm chucking drugs into my system, but I don't know what they're really doing behind the scenes, I don't have a lot of insight and I don't have a lot of control. Part of the reason later on that's so important is I want to try and explain to people some of the interventions that can help them improve their mental health. And in order to sort of sell those interventions, it's useful if people understand the why this will help you. So rather than just saying you need to eat better, it helps me to be able to say, if you eat these things, these will help you build back your levels of your brain chemicals, and this is how it will help you, and this is why that will be beneficial to you. But I need to show people the working out more rather than just saying eat more bananas. So how do the drugs I use affect my mental health? This one's really important for me. This is the idea that we tend to, if we start off with a paradigm that says substance use has a deleterious effect on mental health, then there's nowhere else to go with that. Lots of people use substances. What they want to be able to do is good harm reduction with their substance use, and that includes good harm reduction around my mental well-being as well as my physical well-being. So we do huge amounts around bloodborne virus prevention and safer injecting, and I want to recognize that you can also do the same to an extent with my drugs in terms of my mental health. Have I overdone it? Have I caused permanent damage? One of the things that's probably very scary for people, and certainly the conversations we've had with people is very scary for people, is when people are having a bad time in relation to their drug-related negative mental health state. They're worried that it's going to be forever, that there's to cause some permanent damage. And a lot of the negative experiences people have will be transient, and they will recover. And we need to, so there's a lot of anxiety there and a lot of worry there from people, and we can address that quite quickly. One of the bits I also want to recognize is to try and recognize that we're not all starting from the same place, that some of us are starting from positions of really robust, healthy, good mental health, and some people are starting from a position of less good mental health. Some people might be prone to depression already or anxiety. So this question here is exploring that we don't all start as equals. So when it's saying all my friends who use seem fine, why is it so different for me? It's understanding not just the aspects of the drug and setting, but the individual's response to those drugs. I don't want to assume that everyone who is using the slides is using it in relation to their own substance use. So it might be that it's also people are trying to help someone else, a partner, a friend, a relative who's overdone it. So there's a section in the slides about helping someone else. One of the kind of dominant sort of paradigms again is that we tend to assume that people are using, that there's a risk of pathologizing people's drug use in terms of their mental state. And so we tend to assume people are using because they're escaping a very negative mental illness, like they're self-medicating for psychosis, or they're self-medicating for depression, or they're self-medicating for another negative state, as opposed to seeing it as a way of improving myself. So the use of smart drugs, the use of novel psychoactives to enhance my cognitive enhancement drugs. So the idea that can the drugs I use improve my mental health? Am I microdosing for creativity? Am I using something like modafinil for my learning? So I don't just want to necessarily view it from the perspective of saying I have an illness and I'm medicating to escape my illness. I might well be using for other reasons as well. So these were some of the questions. These were some of the underpinnings that I wanted to explore. Elijah, I've dropped to about 60% speed of my full capacity. Is this okay so far? Because I just want to know if I need to, I can go a little bit slower, but that's good. Thanks, Eliza, appreciate it. It's difficult for me because I do train a lot and I drink too much coffee, hence the very fast. Lovely. So one of the things I want to, one of the discussions that I'd encourage everyone to be having when we start to talk about me using substances and how my substances relate to my mental well-being is the big discussion is always exploring what the function is. What do I get out of it? And I really want to try and understand how I perceive my substance use and how it relates to my mental state. So when I'm talking about this in training, there's several different domains we look at. So for example, there's what you could call very classic self-medicating. So very classic self-medicating. I always feel low. When I use for a while, I feel better. So that's my classic self-medicating, using a substance to elevate mood briefly, probably going down again afterwards. And again, the idea that all the bad thoughts go quiet when I use. So I might be having intrusive voices. I might be having a lot of negative self-talk. I might have the level of noise and chatter in my head is distressing me, and I just get stillness and quiet when I use. So these two here would be very classic sort of self-medicating. Over here, I've got something slightly different, which is probably not talked about as much as I sometimes like. The idea that the medicine from the doctor makes me feel tired, so I use drugs to feel awake again. The idea here is that I'm being prescribed something for a negative mental state. The classic being I might be prescribed something like an antipsychotic, but I don't like the way it makes me feel. I don't like the way it makes me feel sluggish. I don't like the way it makes me gain weight. I don't like the way it affects my libido. So I end up using an additional drug like a stimulant to offset that. So it might be not that I was using to self-medicate for my mental illness, but I'm using to self-medicate against the medication for my mental state. And the classic one of that is people using something to offset the effect of antipsychotics. But the other one we hear all the time is young people who, for example, are prescribed something like methylphenidate, Ritalin, Concerta, and finding that it's upsetting their sleep or affecting their appetite, and so using a drug like cannabis to offset the effects of Concerta, Ritalin. Everyone just wants to fit in, and young people want to fit in as well. And I think one of my classic ones of these is the idea that someone, as a kind of really easy example, it might just be that I feel socially awkward, but on a more complex level, I might be on the autistic spectrum, and when I'm in a room full of people, everyone else is laughing and everyone else is getting the joke and everyone else is feeling close to everyone else, and I don't feel that. And so it might be that when I use a pill, maybe it's like when I use MDMA or something like that, I suddenly feel like I get it. I suddenly feel like I fit in. So all of these are just different examples of that self-medicating. So all this slide's really about is firstly to recognize that all drugs work on the brain, and that because they're working on the brain, they're going to change how I feel in the short and medium term. For some people, that's reasonably predictable. And then when I introduce an existing mental health problem in there, it might be that I find that I'm getting relief from my symptoms. So the key functions that I was exploring, some people might find that using drugs help them avoid or escape unpleasant mental health symptoms. Others find that they feel happier and better when they use drugs, and some people are finding that it helps them cope more. So what I'm always wanting to start the conversation with is not telling people not to do it because it's bad for their mental health, but starting the conversation is, how do you see it in terms of how you feel when you use? How does it work for you? And really trying to turn the conversation around into that understanding of the function of it for the person. Now, this is where it gets a little bit more tricky, and this is probably right up from what she said, right up Eliza Street. I have other slides for this which I would use in training, but I haven't incorporated them into the resource that I've given to Youthrise. I'm a big fan of helping people explore brain chemistry, and I think it's so important that everyone that we're working with, we spend some time helping them understand what's going on behind the scenes. I've been doing training around this with professionals and young people for quite a long time now, and one of the things that I find fascinating and distressing in equal measure is how little time people get to understand what's going on in their heads. And years ago, I was doing a session in the east of England in a town called Norwich with a group of young people. I'd already trained the workers at the drug service, and I was training the young people. And the young people they were sitting down, and we started to explore around the brain chemicals of dopamine, serotonin, how they work, how they make you feel, what happens when the levels of them are high, what happens when the levels of them are low. All these young people were young people who were excluded from school, they were out of work, they had long histories of drug use, and for every single one of them, it was the first time that they'd had that set of conversations. And lots of them had been prescribed. They'd been prescribed antidepressants, they've been prescribed benzodiazepines, they've been prescribed loads and loads of drugs, but not one of them so far had had an understanding of what's going on. And the reason that really matters in the context of all of this is the idea of agency and empowerment. So in order for me to understand, in order for me to have any agency in this, I first have to understand why I feel the way I feel, and then what I can do about it. But because all of this is going on behind the scenes, it's not as easy for me to get a grasp of it. It's not a physical symptom which I can come to terms with so much. And the worry is that because it's a bit of a technical subject, and because it's a specialist subject which is left in the purview of psychologists and psychiatrists and neuropharmacologists, we end up with it becoming a little bit mystifying. And so one of the things that everyone has to be able to do at some point is not oversimplify it, but simplify it enough so that we can explain it to our different target audiences. And when we do that, the experience says that the vast majority of both young people and adults are A, fascinated by it, B, can completely understand it, and C, can then see the value of applying it. So it's very much giving people the keys to their own recovery, or the keys to their own brain, so that they can then not literally, but open it up and understand how it's working, and understand how they can have an impact on that. I've just done some sessions for some couple of people in the north of England, and we've done some sessions around understanding the mental health. And one of the workers on the course today, because we're doing a follow-up session, he was saying that he'd been using some of it with his addicted service users, and been breaking it all down with them. And it's one of those things that's always quite humbling. For me, it's nice when people have been on training go, yeah, I was using it and it worked. But it also is kind of that bit which says we don't always recognize how much the people that we're working with, their desire to understand this stuff and their capacity to understand this stuff is immense. We just don't always break it down enough. So this slide here is just the very start of an introduction about exploring the way that the key brain chemicals, noradrenaline, serotonin, and dopamine work. And what we try and introduce before we start to talk about the impact of drugs, talk about the idea that there's a theoretical, they're meant to be at the so-called right level. And not everyone is obviously at the right level. Some people will be too high, some people will be too low. And that's going to cause changes in my mental state. And then we'll talk about what happens when we introduce drugs on top of that. So we'll introduce the idea that we've got these three brain chemicals. We'll talk about that. The brain tries to keep all these chemicals, and I put it in inverted commas here, at the right level. And by the right level, it's just what would be not showing up with unpleasant, distressing symptoms. And then when levels of them are too high or too low, it can cause unpleasant mental and physical symptoms. And lots of things can send them out of balance. That could be mental illness, stress, physical illness, and lifestyle. And of course, drug use as well. So that's the kind of starting point with this, is the idea that we have to introduce the brain chemicals, and then we have to start to talk about how drugs will impact on those. In order to build on this, part one of this is having a conversation around the function. What does your substance use do for you in the context of your mental state? That's the first conversation, function for you. Second big conversation is understanding a bit about the brain chemicals. One of the really important bits of all of this is to have some emotional literacy, so I'm better placed to describe how I'm feeling to you. So, for example, I might be saying to, and this is English, unfortunately, and I don't know how it translates into lots of other language, but I would say to my worker says to me, how are you feeling today? And I say to my worker, I feel crap. And I'm then relying on working with my worker to break down, well, kind of what sort of crap are you feeling today? Is it a dark, unrewarded sort of place? Is it a sad, weepy place? Is it a no motivation place? Is it a can't sleep, can't do anything place. Because at the moment I don't have the words for that. So one of the useful conversations is to help people develop a language to explain their emotional state better, because that will tie very much to my different brain chemicals. So me being, if I start off by just saying, I just feel crap, that's okay. Okay, so what's up crap? And it might be that we open that up and I say, just feel anxious all the time, just can't settle, just feeling jittery all the time, just I'm pacing around, I sit still, I get up, I move around. So that's helping to unpack the term. So with some of my brain chemicals, like my low levels of dopamine. So on this, I've got high levels of dopamine, low levels of dopamine. So with my low levels of dopamine, I might experience conditions like dysphoria. Everything's bad, everything's wrong, nothing feels good. I might experience anhedonia. I feel unrewarded by everything. I'm doing things that should bring me pleasure, but there's nothing bringing me pleasure. I feel I don't feel assertive and I don't feel confident. I've got very low motivation and very low drive to do anything. And a lot of those things would really talk about the possibly, could be lots of things, but from a brain chemistry point of view, I'm interested in low levels of dopamine here. Persons presenting as sad, blue, weepy, lots of obsessive thoughts, finding it hard to sleep, socially withdrawn, going back into obsessive patterns of like nesting or cleansing or things like that, then I'm interested in things like the serotonin levels. So in order to help do this, first introduce the brain chemicals, and then we work to try and build my vocabulary around my mental state. So I'm not feeling great today. What sort of great are you not feeling? And the more words I've got, the reason this is so useful going forward is the more words I've got or images I've got to describe my mental state, the more mindful I can be about what my mental state is. So I can spot my own symptoms earlier. So for example, once I know, or once I associate that that one gets more anxious when my serotonin levels drop, that one goes into patterns when serotonin levels drop, when one's eye contact and social engagement drops off when my serotonin drops. Once I know that about myself, I can go, okay, so what are my warning signs? And my warning signs might be that I find it hard to make conversation with people. Or my warning signs might be that I might close conversations rather than doing open conversations. And once I know that for myself, I can see my own symptoms really early on before it's become much more risky to myself. And that can help me then have more control over it, because rather than waiting to the point when I'm really depressed, I can go, okay, not feeling great at the moment, need to do something about this. So the more emotional literacy I've got, the more I can relate it back to my brain chemicals, the more I can see my warning signs, and the more I can do something about it. So that's what this diagram's about. Just as this slide here is it's not an aside, but it's just to highlight a couple of extra things. So I've got a negative mental state. It might be things like, and I've already used some of these examples. So we've got the examples of the pills from the doctor for my ADHD stop my appetite and spoil my sleep. Smoking weed helps me with this. I felt depressed, and when I drank alcohol, I felt happier. My friend said I should try CBD to help with my anxiety. She said it was better than tranquilizers, but I had a huge panic attack when I stopped the tranquilizer pills. So there's an example like self-medicating. There's lots and lots of different concepts built into these slides. This slide here, it goes back, this speech bubble here goes back to the idea that I'm self-medicating for something that my doctor's given me. This one here is about, firstly, popular new substances like CBD, but the risks associated with stopping my prescribed medication suddenly and the risks attached to that. This one here is because I am really interested in and really keen to flag up the growing use of psychedelics for microdosing, especially on an experimental basis. And the same with ketamine, that people are using ketamine a lot more to try and self-medicate. This one's here is important because it's about the idea that I might have, it's the same drugs I would have wanted to get from a doctor for the same conditions. So it's saying I can't sleep and have panic attacks. I can't get anything from a doctor because I can't register with a doctor. So I'm buying pills on the street instead. So it's the same medication for the same reasons, but off label. And some of it's about this double-edged nature. So one of the things I want to try and help people recognize and accept is my substance use might both be curative and causative. It's a double-edged sword. So for example, cannabis could simultaneously be helping relieve my anxiety, but also worsening my anxiety. And alcohol could at the same time be alleviating my depression, but worsening my depression. So one of the things that's quite difficult for people to sometimes get their heads around is the idea that cannabis helps me. And I need to get my head around the idea but cannabis can also make things worse. It is helping you, but it's worsening things as well. It's both cause and curative at the same time. It's that double-edged sword. So just thinking here, we've got some people are drawn to non-prescribed drugs to help them cope with unpleasant mental states. That's the starting point for this. Sometimes this might involve the same drugs the doctor would prescribe, but purchased on the streets or off the internet instead. The reason I'm really stressing this, and I'm quite biased here because I'm very conscious of the UK situation. 70% of our drug deaths in the UK involve non-prescribed misuse of benzodiazepines or pregabalin or gabapentin. So the misuse of street drugs, where the same drugs like benzos, but being bought off the internet, is such a significant risk factor in overdoses in the UK that's partly why it's so important. So it's involving a drug that's purchased off the streets or the internet. Fake Valium, fake Xanax, other fake benzos. Others may end up with non-prescribable drugs, which bring risks of legality, quality, and unwanted side effects. For us, an example of that would be people who might be buying, for example, THC online. So they read that THC could help with anxiety. I was doing a training course. This is a terrible example, but it's why it's so important. And it's adults rather than children. But what happened was I had a person on the course whose grandfather had dementia, and the grandfather had anxiety linked to his dementia, and his daughter said, oh, maybe vaping CBD will help you. So the daughter had bought CBD from a local vape shop and took it home to her grandfather, who's in his late 70s, early 80s, with dementia, and he vaped it, but it turned out to be synthetic cannabinoids instead. We have a big problem with synthetic cannabinoids in vaping mixture. So this poor older guy who has dementia and is confused anyway is suddenly having a psychotic episode triggered by spices. I can't imagine how terrifying that must be. So that was the idea, that I might be using non-prescribable drugs, which bring risks of legality, quality, and unwanted side effects. Sometimes the use of drugs in this way may bring relief in the short term, but may increase risks and problems in the longer term. And that's where things like the alcohol use to make me feel better, but then it later makes me feel worse. The smoking cannabis to make me feel better, but then it increases my anxiety. And then there's this extra risk here that I decide. So for example, with the magic mushroom example, or the ketamine example, there's an extra risk if the person uses street drugs on top of their prescribed drugs or stops their prescribed drugs suddenly. So my worry here is, like this example, I start to use CBD because my friend said it will help with my panic attacks, but I suddenly stop my prescribed benzos, so I end up with the risk of benzo withdrawal. Or I have someone who is prescribed an antidepressant like mirtazapine, for example, and then they start microdosing magic mushrooms on top of that. So I'm really concerned where people start to then have this interaction between different drugs, which we need to explore as well. So that's the idea that it's not always going to be illicit substances. It could be alcohol, it could be medication, but being scored on the street instead. It could be completely illicit drugs, or it could be novel drugs. And we also need to look at the interactions. I'm going to do the next one, and then I'm going to pause to give people a chance to ask questions so far. When we when I'm doing training around this, this isn't always the diagram that I use, but it's a useful one in this context. What I'm trying to explore is the idea that, unfortunately, the drugs that I'm using, for example, from a dopamine point of view, the drugs that I'm using tend to elevate my dopamine, but none of them contain dopamine. So we have to introduce the idea that the more I use, I'm going to start off with a large share of a stockpile of dopamine, but my regular and frequent use of drugs will deplete my storage levels of my brain chemicals, my serotonin and my dopamine, until I have very, very low levels. And that takes us back to the idea of it causing a negative state. So I might have started off full. As a person with great mental health, I started off full. As a person with okay mental health, started off 3/4 full. As a person with kind of passable mental health, was in the middle. And a person with poor mental health to start with, I ended up a little bit empty already. I end up running out of my brain chemicals, and then it's going to take time to fill this back up. So what we then need to talk about is the unpleasant symptoms associated with that. And then we need to talk about how we get this tank to fill back up. And that's where we start to look at the holistic interventions around diet and sleep and abstaining to get this tank to fill back up. So the idea here is drugs such as alcohol, heroin, opium, cannabis, amphetamines, they increase levels of these chemicals for a short term, but then afterwards they're going to end up needing to be replaced. And the more often I use, the less chance I have to recover, the less healthy my lifestyle, the less chance I have to bounce back. And we need to talk about how we get those tanks to fill back up. I'm going to tell you more. I'm going to go through the rest of the slides, but I just want to pause for a second. And I'd just like to give everyone a chance to anything that anybody wants to ask so far or chip in with so far, or any observations so far. I'd really welcome any kind of questions or comments so far before we start to go through the next bit of the deck.
Kevin, there's a question there from Tracy. Should I pause the recording maybe? Yeah, there's a question from Tracy.
Yeah, got it. I mean, I know you were saying I have a client who was diagnosed with diabetes. He was prescribed gabapentin. You mentioned that as a problem in the UK. Can you send me in the right direction, Gina? Bloody hell. Okay, that last bit's a bit more full on than I was expecting it to be. Tracy, I get the question. Yeah, we've got, I mean, the problem in the UK is that it's what happens to, on its own in the UK, what happens a lot is it's harder and harder now in the UK to get legitimately prescribed benzodiazepines. So on the NHS, there's a huge clampdown on the prescribing of benzodiazepines like Valium. And what happened was everyone started to try and get prescribed pregabalin and gabapentin instead. So while in the UK we clamped down on our benzos, we ended up with an increasing number of gabapentin and pregabalin prescriptions. And a lot of those leak onto the streets and get sold on the streets. And on their own, they're not the most, they haven't been the most hazardous drugs on their own, but it's in combination that they cause a huge level of fatalities. So in the UK now, something like in England, sorry, 80% of our opiate deaths feature gabapentin or pregabalin as a secondary drug. So it's been the biggest concern that we have is that we've got a whole cohort of people who've become dependent on pregabalin or gabapentin, and it's causing it's called and that's what's causing so many of the overdoses for us. So we have to do a lot of education around it. In terms of your client, we've got plenty of literature about gabapentin and pregabalin, and I can I'm bunging my email in the chat to everyone now anyway, so I'll link you up with what I've got. The only other bit that I'd really stress about it is one of the things that we didn't know so much about when people were, like a lot of drugs, we find out that where people are buying pregabalin on the street and gabapentin on the street, they tend to build up much bigger habits than they would ever have got prescribed. So if I were being prescribed by my doctor, that would keep my prescribing within the sort of normal range. But once I start to buy them on the streets, I can get a much bigger habit than I would ever have got prescribed. And there's some evidence from the literature about when people stop pregabalin and gabapentin, suddenly risk of delusion, hallucinations, and psychotic symptoms in withdrawal. So it's underreported, but there's a few case studies of it where people have had big pregabalin habits stop suddenly and get really, really nasty symptoms, including severe delusion, hallucinations, and things like that. So I'll highlight that one to you, Tracy, and I'll pick back up on that. But if you want to ask anything else in this context, feel free to do so. Is that all right, Tracy? Drop me an email. Thank you. Double-edged nature of drugs, I think it's a huge concept. How do you teach that to the youth you work with so they can hold that nuance in their mind? It's a really good question, Rana. Thank you very much for it. One of the things for me is it's that bit which comes from a lot of the motivational interviewing. It's allowing the positive to exist. I have to start and that's partly why the discussion at the start was, what does it do for you? Rather than denying the person their very real experience that that your substance use is going to have a negative impact on. So if my starting point is that your substance use will have a negative impact on your mental health, I'm not allowing the double-edged sword. I'm only showing one edge of the sword. So my starting point has to be to say, so you like taking this, what do you get out of it? What's it doing for you? And allow that truth to stand, because that's that person's truth. And once I've heard that truth, I'd personally rather allow them to then be able to verbalize a negative as well. So I would then want to follow on by saying, so, but is it always good? And I go, now, sometimes I have a horrible time, or sometimes I smoke too much and I get anxious, or sometimes when I've been doing it too much, I start to actually feel quite low rather than high. So for some people, that double-edged sword is already there. They just need to verbalize it. And then so they're already saying, yeah, most of the time I really love it, it really helps me, but sometimes it doesn't. And so then I can just draw that out and say, so it's almost like it's helping you sometimes, but not helping you other times. They go, yeah, that's exactly. So that's there already. And if it isn't there, I might need to draw it out a little bit more. So I might end up just acknowledging so it's great that you find it really useful. My worry is one of the risks of it could be further down the line, it could cause this. And so then I might just explore what the warning signs were. So if, for example, a young person says, no, I really get on with weed. I love smoking weed. Weed really calms me down and it makes me feel really chilled. And I don't have all the noise in my head all the time. I'd acknowledge the truth of that for that person. That's absolutely fine. Then I go, it's really interesting because quite a lot of people, would say that about their weed. I guess one of the snags is some people might find out further down the line that it might cause anxiety. Or it might cause panic. So perhaps one of the things to be watchful for is if you started to get this or this happening. And so I'm introducing the element of it, but not ramming it down their throat. And the other bit I've got to recognize is, as a young person I might be quite unhappy. I might have a lot of people on my back at school, my family, my psychiatrist, and everyone else is on the back. I'm really defensive about my cannabis use. And at the moment, I'm so defensive about it because it's the one thing that's bringing me happiness and pleasure and feeling good. And if you start to come down on me about that, that's really hard for me it's so hard for me to internalize the negative because I'm so defensive about it. And also the risk is what you end up saying is contrary to what I'm reading in the papers. It's contrary to what I'm reading online. It's contrary to what I'm hearing in discussion groups. So everyone else is saying to me, weed is medicine, weed is good, weed helps with this, weed helps with that. I've cherry picked all that information because that plays to the side that I want to hear. And it's really difficult for you then because you're going to introduce this negative that goes, yeah, but it could cause this. So I've got to do that quite carefully. And that's partly where I'd really be going down a sort of motivational interviewing approach, which is allowing the negative to stand. Allowing the positive to stand, going unchallenged to an extent, and validating that. But then, and that allows me to go. So, does it always feel good like that, or how does it feel the next day? My friend takes MDMA to go clubbing. They finally feel like they fit in. They feel great. They love it. They enjoy themselves. They feel happy at last. So I allow that, and then say, "How about the next day?" And they go, "Sometimes I feel horrible." I go, "Okay, let's chat about that a bit." And that's allowed both to exist in the same space. That'll be my. Here's a nuance, though. You're absolutely right. Cheers, Rana. Thank you. If anybody else wants to chip in, feel free. Otherwise, I'm going to start to. And it kind of picks up on what Rana was saying. Are we all good? Everyone else good? Everyone else looks good. Fine. So it kind of picks up on what Rana was saying. I'm going to, as you know, we've got these kind of families of drugs, and I just wanted to highlight the way that slides are structured here, because this is a bit of the general drugs information. So we've got our depressant drugs, and I'm including here all my benzos, my pregabalin, gabapentin, benzos like temazepam, alprazolam, diazepam, my opiates, and GHB, GBL.
Kevin, could you share the screen?
Sorry, thank you. Cheers, Florian. So I've got my depressant drugs, all slowing down the central nervous system. These are the drugs that we're interested in here. My opiates, my benzos, my Z drugs like zopiclone and zimivane. And the key links with mental health that I really wanted to highlight here, and just understanding the role of self-medicating, providing relief from negative symptoms such as painful memories, anxiety, depression, PTSD, phobias. So the idea that they're going to provide a really good sense of detachment, help me deal with painful memories, help me contemplate painful memories without emotion, provide calm, provide euphoria. So really recognizing the positives, that looking at the links with mental well-being there. What we then want to do, so that was then going back to Rana's point, this is me acknowledging the positives of it, so trying to explore what I get out of it. And then the second part of it is very much the negative, the idea that and this is just exploring it in really, really simple terms, the idea that I felt anxious, my little mental seesaw's too far to the anxious side. I was using pregabalin, gabapentin, Z drugs, and that's helping me feel calm. But over time, I need to take larger and larger doses to keep myself in balance. And then if I suddenly stop using the medication, my personal seesaw is going to go way into anxious, and I suddenly feel more anxious than before. So we're talking about the idea of regular use of these drugs. It leads to tolerance, physical dependence, and especially with the benzos and possibly the pregabalins, some very nasty symptoms. So recognizing that I'm going to get negative symptoms, I'm going to get panic, I'm going to get anxiety, I'm going to, could be very severe, and discouraging people from stopping suddenly with those, and the idea of needing to taper off drugs in these families. So I've got my depressant drugs. One of the areas which is obviously a huge area of growth now has been hallucinogenic drugs, and the upsurge certainly in the UK in terms of people now interested in microdosing with magic mushrooms has just absolutely gone through the roof in the UK. Magic mushrooms were never a really big subject, but in the last 5 years, the interest in it, the upsurge in the use of hallucinogens, less for recreation and more for self-medicating, has really become a lot more mainstream. Been a lot of coverage in the mainstream media about it. So here we're interested in hallucinogenic drugs, magic mushrooms, LSD, ketamine, borderline hallucinogen, and other drugs, including things like MDMA. So we're talking about the interest that it's come from people treating anxiety, panic, PTSD, depression. From a UK point of view, because a lot of the drugs that I'm interested in are heavily restricted, we have to talk about the legal risks. We can't buy magic mushrooms legally in the UK. I know some other countries there is better access to magic mushrooms, and trying to help people recognize that if they are interested in microdosing and they are interested in self-medicating, they need to do a lot of background research first before they start to dive into the subject. Because a lot of people who think they're self-medicating aren't, they're just taking massive doses of mushrooms and wondering why they suddenly feel like they're laughing a lot. So if people are going to use hallucinogenic drugs, doing research about it, looking after themselves, not using on top of medication. And we talk about the unpredictability of it. So very, very keen to do more work about the hallucinogens, because we have this growing cohort of people who are experiencing depression, and they don't necessarily want to use things like antidepressants. So they're thinking, I'll try microdosing with magic mushrooms, but they run the risk of, they haven't done their research, they don't know about dosing, and it creates some real challenges for workers about how to explore the subject of microdosing without colluding with and endorsing people's use of an illicit substance. So it's kind of having discussions with people around, if they were going to microdose, how they're going to do that with as little risk as possible while getting accurate information. So where it says here, this is part of that discussion. While some of the drugs can be legally obtained in some countries for medical use, like ketamine, in others they remain illegal. Using these drugs to self-medicate for mental illness could cause unwanted side effects and may be dangerous if you take them on top of medication or stop taking your medication suddenly. So really wanted to highlight that to people before they start looking at self-medicating. I've got my depressants, got my hallucinogens. Just picking back up on the conversation I was having with Rana and the double-edged nature of cannabis. Rana's absolutely right. And part of the reason I was really stressing this idea was cannabis is such a good example because people are so defensive about their cannabis use. They find it so hard to acknowledge that the cannabis could be causing them anxiety or panic. And that difficulty in accepting that my cannabis use might be causing me some problems is a real barrier. Rana's absolutely right about that. So this slide tries to explore some of that the idea that lots of people who overdo it with cannabis will have episodes of panic or anxiety, normalizing those little transient episodes, that it's a thing that happens. Helping people understand the difference between THC and CBD, helping people recognize that just because your mate gets on with THC really well doesn't mean that you're going to get on with THC really well, and how different individuals react to the same dose. So your mate might be really enjoying it and laughing a lot, but you react badly, and that's okay, and that's normal. And because you react badly, you're probably best off not trying to copy your mate. The heavy use of strong cannabis in young people is associated with an increase in psychotic type symptoms in later life, but it's not clear it's not clear if the cannabis caused these illnesses or whether it was exacerbating something that was already there. This part of it here is one that I'm really keen on. Most people who smoke cannabis don't go from being well to being ill suddenly. What's going to happen is I'm starting to get more frequent episodes of anxiety, panic. And so following on from what Rana was saying, one of the conversations I might have with someone is, so they say, yeah, well, sometimes when I smoke cannabis, I have a bad time, I get all panicky, my heart's racing, I feel dizzy. You go, okay, how often does that happen? And they might say, oh, it's only happened once or twice. And what I'm really looking out for here is the idea the person says, well, it used to only happen once or twice, but it's happening more frequently now. So maybe like every few times I use it, this happens, or it's happening like most times I use it. So one of the conversations we then have is the possibility that your brain is becoming more and more sensitive to THC. And whereas once in a blue moon you had a panic attack, you're now getting them quite often. And the suggestion that perhaps you and strong cannabis aren't getting on so well anymore, and maybe it's time to think about cutting down, using less frequently, having a break altogether, using weaker cannabis. And that again is quite a threatening thought for me to take on board, that I might have to stop using cannabis, but that's what this bit's about. And again, it goes back to that idea of being self-aware enough. I acknowledge the reality that my cannabis might be having a negative impact on me, and vigilant of what those symptoms might look like. And then I can start to say, yeah, actually, that is happening a bit more. Don't like it, but it's true, it is happening a bit more. And then I can start to think about whether I want to do something about it or not. That's my cannabis slide. And this one, this isn't the stimulant slide. In the background, you can just about make it out. In the background, there's a roller coaster, because it's a useful analogy for exploring the stimulants part of it. So the stimulants, obviously, cocaine, amphetamine, Ritalin, cat, crystal, and so on and so forth, and lots of the newer synthetic drugs, things like MDPV or methadone, MCAT. So the idea that during use, they're causing levels of my brain chemicals like dopamine and adrenaline to go very high. That's causing me all the excitement and the euphoria. But if I don't give myself a chance to recover, I'm going to have very low mood. And so during use, it's exciting. Then I've got my crash. The other part to stress is that while I hope my stimulants are going to give me euphoria and reward and excitement, if my brain chemicals are going way, way, way too high, I might not end up with pleasant symptoms. I might end up with unpleasant symptoms. I might end up with delusion, hallucinations, psychotic type symptoms, loss of insight, profound panic and paranoia. So too much of these brain chemicals being less enjoyable, causing delusions and hallucinations. And some of the effects that people get are very similar to psychotic episodes. And then again, as they wear off, I've got low brain chemicals. As they wear off, brain chemical levels drop. This makes the person feel worse, craving, depressed, irritable. And that goes back to the idea that if I use again, it won't go as high because I need to wait until my brain chemicals have recovered. And we'll talk about how we recover afterwards. So that was to introduce the key families of drugs and just recognizing that each one's going to do something slightly different. I've just got a cat that's appeared from nowhere. It's always good for your mental health. This one here was an important one around a very specific family of drugs, which are so the jargon, the slang around this being around chemsex drugs. So it's looking at drugs that are used in the setting of sexual enhancement, sexually enhanced drugs, enhanced sexual experiences. So we're looking at things like GHB, GBL, crystal meth, and possibly methadone rather than crystal meth, and looking at the multiple exclusions that it could exist here, the impact of the substance use on my mental health, plus the impact of my sense of self, my gender identity, my sexual identity, and how those can interact to affect. So me having a bad come down of crystal, reinforcing my own sense of worthlessness, low mood, feeling dirty, feeling soiled, the importance of related. So not just looking at the pre-existing mental health, but the other social factors that could worsen my sense of well-being, my sense of vulnerability, my poor self-esteem, my poor self-regard. So part of it was looking at the relationship between why I might want to be using these drugs in a sexual setting, how it's going to impact on my mental health, but also how it's then going to make it harder for me to enjoy sex without drugs, and the importance of looking at the relationship between the two. I'm really lucky in London in that we've got some very, very good services specializing in working around chemsex and offering dedicated counseling services around chemsex, but they're very few and far between. So needing some specific resources around that, the relationship between the mental health aspects of it, the substance related aspects, and the wide issue of sexual identity being a really, really important part of this, and gender identity. So we've set the scene, we've talked about the brain chemicals, we've talked about the specific drugs, and then what we need to do is get to the point where we have some tools to help support people to maintain better mental health while still using. So I don't want to get this to a position ideally where we end up saying the only way to resolve this is not to use. Because again, going back to Rana's point, if the only message I've got is don't use, if you want good mental health, don't use, then I'm going to lose a lot of the people who are keen to use. So I need to try and explore how, if you are able to keep everything in balance, you can enjoy some aspects of your drug use while enjoying good mental health, but you need to be able to do these things in balance. And so the key aspects of this that I would want to highlight. First bit is talking about, we've talked about the brain chemicals, we've introduced serotonin, we've introduced dopamine, we've talked about them. So then we need to talk about how they're made in the body. So we're talking about how the food that I eat contains the building block for my brain chemicals. And if I'm eating crap, then if I'm eating really bad quality food, then I'm not getting the building blocks. So we need to then say, look, if you're going to do MDMA at the weekend, what do you do the following week to look after yourself? If you're mostly lying on your bed, eating lots of crisps and drinking Coke all the time, you're not replacing your lost brain chemicals. So we need to talk about how you do that, and how you do that, especially if you haven't got a lot of money or you're in a food desert. So we talk about things like healthy diet with lots of the building blocks for brain chemicals, fresh fruit and veg, dairy, eggs, milk, yogurt. So we're talking about the stuff that contains like the building block tryptophan, which will convert into serotonin, the building block tyrosine, which will convert into dopamine. So the healthy diet with lots of the building blocks. You're going to do MDMA on Saturday, you need to be making sure that when you're eating again, nice healthy bowl of porridge, lots of chopped banana in it, bit of yogurt on top, sprinkling of sunflower seeds, jobs are good. And taking breaks, so going back to the roller coaster idea, taking breaks from use to allow your brain to recover. Recognizing that, for example, with a lot of the stimulants, if I'm doing it once a month, that's probably sustainable. If I'm doing it once every 3 weeks, probably sustainable. Once every 2 weeks, you're lucky to sustain it. If I'm doing it weekly or daily, I'm going to run out of brain chemicals. I need to take a break and give myself a chance to recover. We talk about appropriate exercise, but I'm really interested in not less the exercise part of it and more the daylight part of it. So I'm not especially interested, I'm not saying I'm not interested in exercise, but I'm less interested in significant physical exercise. I'm interested in the person getting outside in daylight, being mindful, and social activity. So what I always end up saying to people when we're doing training is, look, the last thing I want someone doing is going to the gym, being under artificial lights, listening to pounding music with your headphones on, running on the treadmill to try and make yourself feel better, because it doesn't work that well. Going out with a friend, having a walk, being in sunlight, being in air, getting some exercise and being mindful is far, far better as an intervention than the treadmill in this setting. So that's why it's saying exercise ideally outside in daylight with a friend. I'd much rather someone did that than hit the treadmill. Maximizing good quality natural sleep, reducing use of caffeine. So I feel tired, I feel run down. The temptation is to hit the Red Bull, the energy drinks, the Coke, try and perk myself up, trying to actually get myself to sleep. I acknowledge that I'm tired, allow myself to be tired, sleep, recover, recuperate. One of the bits about trying to help people recover is, for example, I've been using stimulants. Stimulants have used up a lot of my brain chemicals. They've used up a lot of my dopamine. I'm left feeling anxious. In food, the building block tyrosine. So in food, we get tyrosine, and tyrosine converts in brain to the precursor brain chemical L-DOPA, which converts into dopamine. But in turn, tyrosine is also, and dopamine are also used to make adrenaline or noradrenaline. So the problem is that as long as I'm feeling anxious, as long as I'm feeling stressed, as long as I've got a lot of edginess, I'm not going to get my dopamine levels back up to normal. So every time that I'm feeling anxious, every time I'm having a panic attack, every time I'm feeling stressed, I'm using up some of my tyrosine and some of my dopamine to make my stress chemicals. So this part here, using relaxation techniques and breathing exercises to manage stress, is to try and stop this process happening so that I can then build my dopamine levels back up. And then lastly, recognizing that I feel rotten. My desire is to isolate from other people. My desire is to not get out of bed, and telling people that you feel like that is very healthy. Not so that they can drag you out, but being able to say, I don't feel great. And it might just be someone coming around and sitting on the edge of your bed and chatting to you. So when it says don't isolate yourself, it doesn't necessarily mean you've got to go out and party to feel better. It's just trying to avoid isolation. So with good self-care, your drug use doesn't have to cause harm to your mental health, but we all have to look after our brains. And that's the kind of some of the linchpins of trying to look after myself while I'm still using. On a professional level, what I'm using a lot of this for isn't just while people are still using. I'm working with a lot of drugs workers, and so a lot of this is the stuff that we're trying to put in place to help people who are coming off long histories of crack, cocaine use, alcohol use. So trying to get it incorporated into housing more and day programs more to get the pillars of good mental health in place. So it's mostly, I'm using it a lot for people who are trying to achieve recovery, but it's all equally applicable to young people who want to carry on using but enjoy their use more. So what I was saying earlier, the more I've developed my my emotional literacy, the greater my extent of my emotional literacy, the better placed I am to be able to become watchful of my own emotional state and see when I'm starting to slide. So my first part of this is I want people to be mindful and aware, of your mood and mental health, and so that you can avoid being aware of this can help you avoid it getting too bad. So avoid drug use worsening mental health problems. Spot where drugs may be having an impact on mental health, and then act earlier before mental health issues become serious. So I'd like to be able to spot it and act rather than waiting till it's become a crisis. I really don't want it to become a mental health crisis. So this is part of what I want. This is encouraging people to do these things. Keeping a diary, making a note of how episodes of drug taking may have impacted on my mental health. Had a great time, felt really low for 3 days afterwards. So this week took MDMA, marvelous night out, but felt low for 3 days. Then next time I take MDMA, I look at my diary and went, quite a good night, felt really low for 5 days. And then the next time I went out, I look at my diary and go, it was an okay night, felt terrible for 7 days. And straight away, I can see that my drug use is having a negative impact on my mental health. It's having an accumulative impact, and that's kind of helping me. So how are you feeling before you used? Did you feel anxious? Was it worse than normal? How long did it take to recover after using? Is recovery taking longer? What symptoms was I getting? And being vigilant for this and aware of it and mindful of it and watchful of it can help me go, that's interesting. I don't usually get that sort of paranoid and edgy feeling, but I'm really getting that. The last 3 times I've used, I've been getting paranoid and edgy. I need to watch that. So overall, how has your mood been before and after episodes of drug use? And the only way I'm going to know that really clearly is by keeping some little notes, little diary of it, so I can see my own symptoms coming through. Look out for patterns. Learn to spot your warning signs, and it says your warning signs, not the warning signs, your warning signs, because everyone's different. If you can see them before they get serious, you can take action and hopefully prevent a mental health crisis. And again, I go back to the examples like becoming socially withdrawn, finding it difficult to maintain eye contact. On a personal level, I know for myself, for example, that when at the moment you can't see it, but my desk's fairly untidy at the moment. And that's a good thing, because when my desk's fairly untidy, it shows that I'm in a reasonably good mental health state. What I start to worry about is when I'm having to put everything at right angles and line everything up and get distressed if it's not at right angles. And the moment you're going, you're straightening stuff, Kev, then you know you're not having a great mental health time, and it's time to start sort of eating more bananas, eating more yogurt, getting more exercise, getting more sunlight. So I know my own symptoms, and I can use that to help me preempt my symptoms. Look out for the patterns. So key warning signs could include episodes of anxiety during or after use, the come down getting worse, time taken to recover taking longer, finding other things that you used to like doing being less rewarding. I'm not being dictatorial with this, it's just trying to use examples to shape that. If you spot these or other warning signs, it's a good time to take a break from using. If you find this difficult to do, it's a sign that you may be struggling to control your use. So now I've got a language for this. I can say, look, I know my warning signs. I know that my cannabis use is making my mental health worse. I should really be taking a break from my cannabis use, but I'm feeling it really hard to step away from my cannabis use. That's a good time for me to be getting some help, for example, from a drug service. So speaking to a drug service or other helping agency would be useful at this stage. And then if you look after your brain and body, watch for warning signs, act on them as early as possible. You may be able to balance your drug use and maintain your mental health better. But it is important that you listen to yourself and other people. So when the warning signs appear, you're ready and able to act on them. And this bit's important, not just listening to my own warning signs, it's other people saying, you know, Kev, you're not yourself at the moment. You might not see it yourself at the moment, but you're not yourself at the moment. You need to sort of be reflective of that as well. So that's the idea of that. I can use my learning how I feel and learning my warning signs to have better control over my patterns of substance use. I'm just going to pause there. I've actually there's a couple more to do, and I'll tell you about the next two because they're going into a slightly different place. But again, I just want to quickly pause for a second and give people a chance to, and Florian will remind me to turn the slides back on afterwards. Does anybody want to ask anything or chip in or any comments so far? You all right? I just also at this point just wanted to really say a big thank you to the team at Youthwise for all the graphics, because I made all the slides look really, really nice and they're really friendly. So I just wanted to quickly say that as well, because it's the first time I've gone through them. I've had a look at them briefly since they did all the graphics and stuff. But you've done a lovely job. Is everyone feeling okay with the direction of this so far, or is there anything? Okay, cheers, Rana. Thank you. So far, a lot of this has been about me looking at my own use and my own understanding of my brain, and it's a lot about me trying to take care of myself. And the other strand of this is me wanting to try and empower other young people as friends, as relatives, and as peers to support people. Because if I might not want to go to a professional, I might not want to go to a helping agency, I might not have access to those services. So some of this is helping support my peers and those around me to upskill them. And that upskilling kind of goes into a couple of different phases. It's upskilling in terms of an acute episode when I'm having panic, when I'm having anxiety, but it's also when I'm on come down and having low mood and things like that. So this next part is just a little slide, which I really like this one, and I think it's really nicely delivered. The content I really like is, if a friend is struggling to cope with their mental health, whether it's to do with drug use or not, their friends can be an important source of health and support, and that's the kind of key message with it. And a lot of it isn't drug specific, but it's a lot of the general stuff around supporting someone who's experiencing poor mental health. So first bit is going back to the idea that especially my drug-induced stuff, my drug-induced negative mental state is likely to be transient and it will go away. And at the point where I'm experiencing those symptoms, I might not believe that, and I might not see that, and I might feel horrible. So this slide just reminding the person that they are loved and these unpleasant feelings are likely to go away. Support the person with the activities which we know are good for their mental health. Going for a walk in the sunshine, eating some healthy food, playing with pets, chilling together and watching a film. I was trying to move away from a model that says, I must drag you out to a comedy night to make you feel better, or I must take you out clubbing because it'll cheer you up. Those things aren't necessarily good. So we're doing the things that I know are going to be positive from a mental health point of view, and having my friends who are supportive of that. Let them know that you're there for them, even if they don't want to speak to you straight away. Dropping them a message every now and then. Balance letting them know you feel you care without making them feel pressured to speak to you. So just checking in and going, just give me a quick message, hope you're okay, I'm here for you, because that might be all I need to do sometimes. Let the person say how they feel and don't make them try and feel differently. Allow the person to be sad, don't make them pretend to be happy for you. I need to be able to verbalize, I'm feeling terrible at the moment, I'm feeling horrible, and I don't necessarily need to try and change that, I just need to acknowledge it at the moment rather than trying to turn it around. Don't exclude people who are struggling, include them in activities, but allow them to engage or not as they want to. And if all your activities are drug related, maybe think of doing something different that they can take part in, which would be better for their mental health. So what I'm saying here is that if all we ever do is go out and smoke a lot of weed and party, then I can't be really part of that at the moment. So maybe if I am really your friend, we think about doing some different things so that you can be part of that. Let's have a meal together instead. And then when you are at that meal, just allow me space to be me rather than pressuring me to have to perform. If you can see early signs that a person is struggling with their mental health, try and raise this with them in a sensitive way. Don't judge what they're doing, but talk to them about that you are worried about them and you care. So rather than saying you're doing this and it's not good for you, saying I'm worried about you and I really care about you is probably a better way to start the conversation than saying you shouldn't be doing this, it's bad for you. And these two, I guess these two are really important as well. They're difficult, especially for peers and especially for young peers. So bear in mind that some of these resources are aimed at teenagers. These are really difficult concepts, but I need to stress these concepts because if I am using a lot of drugs and it is having a really big impact on my mental health, my friends might not be able to deal with that, and I need them to know that rather than trying to keep it, my desire to keep things secret, my desires to keep it amongst my peers is very strong. But if you're really worried about your friend and are concerned that they could hurt themselves, talk to someone. It may feel like breaking their trust, but sometimes it might be essential to keep the person safe. That has to be in there, because my heavy substance use might be triggering something really, really serious. And as the peer in this, I need to be able to know that it's okay to share that with an appropriate adult. And as a young person, I'm taking on a lot here. I'm looking after my friend. My friend's depressed. My friend's isolating. My friend's talking about hurting themselves. My friend is really upset. And I need to look after myself too. It's not all on me to look after your friend. You can't take it all on yourself. So practice what you preach and look after your own mental health too. So those things were really kind of an important part of not just working with the end user in all of this, but working with the people around them and looking at how they could be both an asset, but also needing to look at their well-being. And then the last part of this, the last really difficult one, I really struggle with this one because it's all about the interface between substance use, drug services, and professional healthcare. And it's a really difficult subject area. And it's a difficult slide to phrase, partly because of the inequalities of people accessing healthcare, but also the fact that I might not want to speak to my healthcare. If I've got a healthcare provider, I might not want to speak to them about my substance use. I might feel judged. I might think that I'm going to get into trouble. It's going to go on my health records. It could be something that ends up with me being admitted to hospital or detained against my will. So this is saying it's not always easy to speak to professionals like doctors, especially about drugs and mental health. I might not have access to a doctor. You may not want to talk to them about drugs or mental health. And unfortunately, in my experience, a lot of the doctors don't know that much about illicit substance use when it comes to mental health. They just tend to say, don't do it, it's bad. So I might not feel able to talk to them. Having said that, there are some times when it would be really useful to talk to a healthcare professional if you can. And I have to stress that, even though I recognize the difficulties of it, is trying to say, if you can, have these conversations. So if you are thinking about coming off prescribed medication because you want to self-medicate with non-prescribed drugs. So if I'm, for example, prescribed antidepressants and I'm thinking about stopping my antidepressants because I want to use magic mushrooms instead, I don't necessarily want the doctor's blessing about the mushrooms, but I need the doctor's guidance about tapering off the antidepressants. So I need to have that conversation. So if you're thinking about coming off prescribed medication because you want to self-medicate with non-prescribed drugs, this could cause withdrawal symptoms. So it's essential you do so as safely as possible. If you're planning to use non-prescribed drugs on top of your medication, this could cause serious interactions, which could be dangerous or life-threatening. So if I'm thinking of, for example, using ketamine for my PTSD, but I'm already prescribed another drug, are there any interactions there that I need to worry about? My doctor might not know that. And if you're experiencing symptoms of poor mental health and they're getting worse despite or because of your drug use, at some point I'm going to need to engage with professional services, and that's going to be a difficult journey for me to do. So that's the ideal, if you can have those conversations, but that assumes A, access to healthcare, and B, sympathetic, empathetic, and informed healthcare. And neither of those things might be true. I get that. If you can't talk to a doctor or a nurse about your drug use and mental health, there may be a drug support agency locally who can give you advice. So that's where a lot of you guys are coming in. These services aren't just for people seeking help for addiction. The reason I'm stressing that is because there's this misunderstanding a lot that I only go there for help in stopping, whereas a lot of drug services will be able to give advice around my mental health and safer usage. Some will be able to offer advice and guidance for people who are still using. Schools and colleges may have support staff who can help, who you can talk to for help. Websites, good websites who have information about drugs and mental well-being, so you can read up on other people's experience, and discussion groups. And the last bit of this, the important thing is to know that sometimes you need some help to deal with the problem, and knowing where to go and who to speak to can be really helpful. So it's this idea that I have to recognize that I would like to be able to do a lot of this myself through understanding my brain chemistry. So rewinding, through understanding my brain chemistry, through understanding the drugs, and through understanding the nuts and bolts of self-care, I can hopefully manage a lot of my symptoms. But I also need to recognize that sometimes I can't, and it's gone too far and I'll need help. but that help might be hard to find as well. So that's the primary set of slides. And as I say, I'm going to be making some, over time, we'll correct some typos, maybe change some layout a little bit, bring the text out. Florian and the team will be kind of contacting a lot of other people to get your feedback on the content and things you'd like to see more of. I guess what I'm going to do there is I'm going to pause and I'm going to throw it open to two things. Firstly, it's for me, it would be a general sort of any comments, any observations, any feedback on the first part of it, and then more general questions. So, for example, Eliza was asking about or talking about the impact of COVID and COVID on NPS use and COVID on mental health. So if there's other areas of discussion around the interface between drugs and mental health, that would be a good time to have this as well. I'm going to pause myself now and just pass over to Florian to coordinate this next bit, if that's okay, Flor.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much, Kevin. Though I think these are fantastic, and once we tweak a little bit, I think they're going already they're really useful. And I'd also really like to thank Ruby and Carolina who've done the graphic design on them. So it's very cool. So thank you very much, Kevin, because it's one thing that always usually when you ask about drugs and mental health, and that's what we were approached for before, is just either just say no is the predominant approach that we were often told. And so it's great to start talking, trying to create something for people who are still using and trying to identify issues within that and how to support them. Yeah, so I'll open it up to anyone want to make some comments or have some questions for Kevin. Elisa, did you want to talk about your question?
Thank you for inviting to ask a question. Yeah, first of all, thank you so much, Kevin. I really appreciate what you did. It was brilliant presentation, and it was so easy to listen, because I think so this topic sometimes is really could be complex, and if the experts are trying to explain it, usually it's very hard to listen and to understand. So I do appreciate all your efforts and how you explained. So it was really interesting to hear. I have a question which is also related with mental health, but maybe just a little bit more far away from the presentation. So sometimes it can happen that a person can have such a called dual diagnosis. So, for example, faces some mental health issues, but also have a particular drug dependency. My question is, do you know how the treatment should be organized in that case? Should, first of all, a person go to the mental health specialist, or for the drug or to the addiction center for the drug dependency treatment, or should it go somehow together? Because I know that in some countries it's one institution which is working on these two issues, but in some countries these are two different institutions, mental health and addiction center, they're separated. So in that case, how to ensure that the person can receive a comprehensive and comprehensive support and care regarding both issues?
I can only speak from the UK experience in this, and I know every country's got its own different pathways on this and different processes. So quite a few years ago, there was a guidance document that came out in the UK, and it was a dual diagnosis good practice guide. And what it said at the time was what had happened was there's this ongoing game of ping pong between mental health and drugs, and the person with the problem ends up getting bounced between services. So the drug service says we think it's a mental health problem, it's referred to mental health services, they go it's a drug problem, and the person's deteriorating all the time. And what the guidance said was, look, it doesn't really matter which came first. Don't worry about the chicken and egg. If the person has a significant episode of poor mental health, whether it's drug related or not, mental health services should be the lead agency. Doesn't mean that they're the exclusive agency for care. They should be the lead, because it's more about someone taking ownership of the situation. And then once someone's taken ownership of the situation, then we can start to bring in other agencies as needed, whether that's housing, whether that's drugs. Now, in my own model, personally, what would end up happening is something like this. I have a person who is unwell. At the moment, they're experiencing distressing symptoms, and they're using drugs. And some of it is about how much do I know about the person? So do I have a good long family case history? Because the more I've got a case history and the more I know the person, we can see that their mental health was deteriorating, then the drugs came along. But I don't always have that. I might have someone who's, for example, street homeless, and all I've got at the moment is someone who's significantly depressed, paranoid, delusional, and smoking a lot of crack. And so I don't know the case history, so I don't know which came first. In some respects, I don't need to know at this point. So one of the things we're always saying in training is don't, at the start of the discussion, don't worry about the chicken or the egg. You've got someone who's paranoid. You've got someone who's delusional. You've got someone who's having hallucinations. You don't necessarily need to know what caused it, but you need to know how to work with that. And so the first part is stability. And what I'd like to do is then say, okay, so I don't know which is causing what. So I need to support the person to stop using for a while. So it does come to drug treatment now. And the reason I want you to stop using for a while is I want to see if the symptoms get better or worse. And if, for example, you have been using a lot of crack and you're paranoid and you're delusional and you stop smoking crack and the symptoms start to abate, then I'm reasonably confident that it was like classic stimulant-induced psychosis. Whereas if someone comes off the drugs and actually the symptoms start to get progressively worse, then it suggests that the drugs were overlaying an existing mental illness. But I won't know that until the person, so part of what I want to do is create an environment where the person feels safe enough in housing, safe enough in their environment to say, okay, I trust you enough now to stop using for a while, but that's not stopping using on the basis that I'm going to feel better. It's stopping using on the basis to see what's underlying it. And then we need to, part of the drugs training part of it is then sort of saying, how long do I, so for example, my low mood and my depression, I've been smoking crack for a long time, I stopped smoking crack. How long could I end up with taking for my dopamine to get back to normal? And I'm going to give that, you know, for someone who's got a heavy habit of heroin and crack use and being homeless, 3 to 6 months is a realistic time frame for me to get my brain chemistry back to something approaching my normal. And at the end of that sort of period, I can go, okay, look, we've done everything right. You've been abstaining, you're eating well, you're sleeping well, but you're still experiencing significantly low mood. And I'm now satisfied that it's not just drug-induced low mood or withdrawal low mood or post-drug low mood. This is, for want of a better phrase, this is you. Underneath the drugs, this is you. So for some drugs, like say I'm coming off benzos and I've stopped using benzos and I'm having panic and anxiety and shakes and phobic episodes, for 12 months, I'm really happy to put my panic and my anxiety and my phobic episodes down to the tail of withdrawing from benzos. So I can't in that 12 months be really confident that your panic attacks and your phobias are benzo withdrawal or an underlying mental illness. The longer it goes on, the more and more satisfied I am that this is nothing to do with the benzos now. This is now me being much more confident, but it doesn't actually matter because I still have to do this, whether it was caused by the benzos or the benzo withdrawal or whether it's an underlying mental illness, it's the same interventions. How do I support someone to cope with panic? How do I support someone to cope with anxiety and so on and so forth? Just to give you a little example. So I was using this example, this is my box of drugs. I was using this example earlier, which is talking about butane gas misuse, which is a significant issue. So one of the side effects of butane gas misuse is it gives very good hallucinations, as you probably know. And so butane gas is quite a useful drug for self-medicating for psychosis. So if I use enough butane gas, it will cause some pretty good hallucinations and it can drown out my own internal voices. So it's like the drug equivalent of turning the television up really loud. And in England, if I've got someone who's 30 plus and using gas, I'll give you odds 99 times out of 100, there's an underlying diagnosis of schizophrenia there, 99 times out of 100. But what I need to do is I need to get this person who's using gas is currently street homeless. So I need to get them into housing and I need to get them feeling safe enough so I can say to them, can we try stopping gas for just a couple of days? Don't want you to, and we're not talking about quitting, just as an experiment, and they go, okay, I'll try. You'll look after me, but I'll try. And then we'll see what happens. And by day 3, the person's having really intrusive voices, really persecutory thoughts, and is deeply distressed. And I know, because of the drug side of it, that's not gas withdrawal. What I now know is underlying the gas use, there was an underlying mental illness. And then the person goes, I've done 2 days, I can't cope with my head anymore, I'm back on the gas. That's okay. Now we've got better insight, because now what I can do is go back to the drugs team, the mental health team, and say, we worked with this customer, we've supported them to stop using gas. When they stop using gas, their levels of distress go up. My expertise in drugs tells me that this isn't withdrawal, this is an underlying mental illness. My guess is then, if we get to that point, it can medicate the mental illness, the rationale for using the gas goes away. And it make it easier for me to stop using gas. But I have to create, so going back to your question, the desire is to have a holistic intervention. It's not one first, then the other. It has to be the two together, but there has to be someone taking ownership of it. And the guidance from the UK originally was that it was the mental health service leads. The snag is that at the moment, obviously, and it's a COVID thing as well, all the services are massively overstretched. And so people are still bounced between services constantly. And I get a lot of times when people are saying the mental health service won't see my customer. So I end up having to help explain to the services how to make sure that they're really clear that this isn't just an aspect of my drug use. So you've got someone who's doing really dangerous injecting, like injecting around their eyes or injecting around their face or something. And I want them to go to a mental health service because I'm really worried about their self-harming. And the mental health service is going, they're injectors. Injectors stick needles in strange places. And you're going, this isn't an aspect of their injecting behavior. This is something very different. This is coming from distress, self-harming, parasuicidal behaviors, desire to blind self and stuff like that. And that's the more confident I am as a drugs worker, the more I can help separate out what's normal drugs and what's not.
Thank you so much. And
Yeah.
Rana, go.
Yeah.
Hi, Kevin, and thank you so much, Youth Rise, for putting this on. Kevin, this was amazing. I'm a drug educator based in California, and it's always so refreshing and enlightening seeing how other people how we're making this ecosystem happen. So thank you for your approach and all your information. I was curious, it seems like motivational interviewing is like underlying the style and the approach of a lot of this. And I'm wondering if you've done, or if there are resources around training youth who use drugs as motivational interviewer, in motivational interviewing to do like brief intervention. It seems that, they are on the front lines and experiencing themselves or their friends, and intuitively may know how to bring the style and approach like non-judgmental and compassionate communication. And so curious about, does that resource currently exist? And if so, how do we do it?
Not for me. I don't know about for anyone else. I'm not the two bits. I'm as you would have gathered, I'm really keen to try and use a lot of empowerment as I can. What we have been doing, and I think I think you're absolutely right, and it really throws up lots of ideas about resources to develop in the future. I mean, what I've got so far is some young people have been within education are being trained to do mental health first aid. So they're not as far down the line as being able to do the how to support and catalyze change, but they're how to respond to crises. One of the things, and it goes back to Eliza's observations around COVID, in order to tackle drug-related deaths, one of the things we've done so much of is roll out of naloxone to adult opiate users. And one of the things that I've been really conscious of is we need to have the sort of parallel interventions for young people who are taking things like MD and other drugs. And during lockdown, it was really important. Like last summer when I was doing a lot of training, we were really, really stressing this, because it was like, for an adult going to a nightclub or a festival, like an organized festival, an organized nightclub, there are risks, but the risks are mitigated because there's things like pill testing at the nightclub, or there's pill testing at the festivals, and there's paramedics on site, and there's ambulances available, and there's phone reception. And then in lockdown, we had these cohorts of young people who were going to unlicensed music events, they're partying by the beach, they're partying in the woods, they're partying down by the quarry. And when you're in those environments, it takes away all the safeguards. There's never going to be pill testing. There's never going to be running water. There's not going to be paramedics on site. And there's actively people who are organising the event who don't want emergency services called because they don't want to get the sound systems confiscated. So what we were talking about a lot over the summer was this idea of going, okay, a lot of our harm reduction is orientated to the person who takes the pills. Take less, drink water, give yourself a chance to cool down. But the other part of it, which was really interesting, was then to say, how about chatting more to the other young people? If you're at that music event and your mate's having a crap time or someone's starting to become ill, do you know how to respond to that? And empowering them to be able to say, this person at the event's not looking well. And just like we do with naloxone and heroin, as a 15-year-old, I'm scared witless that this person's starting to froth and convulse and is too hot. But I can calm myself down. I'm not going to panic. I'm not going to run away. I'm not going to listen when the organizer says, no paramedics, we'll deal with it. I'm going to call an ambulance for my friend. I know how to get them to where I am. I know how to use what 3 words. I know how to keep them cool. And so I haven't got as far as you're talking about, Rana, in terms of the desire to build in those motivational interviewing things. I think it's a really, really interesting piece of work, and it would be one that I think would be so, so valuable. Those bits of a skill set. At the moment, we haven't got as far as telling young people how to save other young people from having an MDMA overdose. But it doesn't mean, I think it's an absolutely lovely idea and I really wanted to pursue. That's Youth Rise's next bit of work, Florian.
Yeah, exactly. We can try that out for the next budget request. Is there any other questions from anyone else? Tracy, Evelyn, Carolina, Beatrix, Brenda, or Mike?
Tracy, lovely to have you here.
I just would like to clarify the pregabalin. Is it a prescribed drug in UK?
Yeah, very much so. So, okay. As I say, what happened was, so primarily it's used as a, it's Lyrica is one of the brand names. Primarily it's used so it's for anxiety, for sleep, and for neuropathic pain. It's massively, massively prescribed. In the UK, what started to go wrong, as in the UK, you know, we've got the system where we have prescription medicines, some of which are just prescription, and some of which are covered by our Misuse of Drugs Act, so they're also controlled drugs. So a drug like methadone is a prescription medicine and a controlled drug, whereas a drug like Prozac is a prescription medicine but not a controlled drug. So the scrutiny for the prescription medicines is a lot lower. Once a drug becomes a controlled drug, there's lots more scrutiny to the prescription writing. So historically, what had happened was there was so much overprescribing of benzodiazepines and Z drugs like Zopiclone. So they've been really clamped down on, and doctors started to prescribe a lot more pregabalin and gabapentin instead. So in the space of 8 years, I think it was, the number of deaths featuring pregabalin and gabapentin went up from something like 4 deaths a year to something like 200 deaths a year, which by UK standards is quite a lot. And then it's carried on going up. And then
is it like people are using it alone, or they're like topping up on some other drugs? Like, so
the classic combo for us, and the deathly combo for us, is the presence of alcohol, the presence of a benzo family drug or a GABAergic like pregabalin, and the presence of an opiate, and that's our toxic trio. So you have someone who's prescribed methadone, drinking and taking pregabalin, and that's the thing that kills. So whenever we're doing overdose awareness, you sort of say one side of the triangle bad, 2 sides of the triangle very bad, 3 sides of the triangle, and we're really, really concerned about that. So very few of our overdoses are single drug overdoses in the UK. So what happened in the UK was it started in prisons, where in prisons it was getting hard. They wouldn't prescribe me an opiate, they wouldn't prescribe me a benzo. And in the north of England, all the prisoners were going to the doctors and going, I've got sciatica, I've got pain in my sciatic nerve. And they all got prescribed pregabalin. And it was this kind of almost a standing joke where they're all going like, so many of our prisoners have got sciatica. And it was because they were teaching each other what to say at the hatch. So we ended up with this entire prison population all being prescribed pregabalin. And then at that point, the government moved it to being a controlled drug. but by then we've already created this huge problem, and it's an absolute nightmare. So whenever you talk to a drugs worker in the UK and you say to them, what's the most problematic prescribed drug that you see, every single one of them who works with adults, and it's mostly adults, not young people, will all say pregabalin.
Yeah, and a few, just completely anecdotally, so I can't back that up, but from some people who I was working with, pregabalin, like they had much worse time with pregabalin and withdrawing from pregabalin than the said drugs or the benzos. Yeah. Like it really isn't. Yeah, it's.
Yeah. So
that you know.
We don't see so much, like methadrone's relatively rare in the UK now. It's still available, but it's relatively rare. We don't see so much alpha PVP either, though there's some bits of it do crop up a bit, though it's not so widespread. So most of our Lyrica use, most of our pregabalin use is as an adjunct to opiates rather than come down from stimulants. So the main pattern, so for example, if I'm prescribed methadone and I'm on substitute prescribing, I'll get urine tested, and if I use heroin on top, that will create an issue, whereas if I use pregabalin on top, it won't. So the dual use there is much more to potentiate opiates. And one of the side effects of COVID at the moment seems to be that the UK opiate market is especially poor at the moment. So our heroin is hovering around probably some of the reports coming out in sort of Manchester and the Midlands, 5 to 10% purity, which is maybe a quarter of what it was. So the UK norm is somewhere in the region of 20 to 30%. And so as the quality of our opiates drops, more and more people with bad quality heroin are supplementing it with benzos. So we do get people who are prescribed, so pregabalin ends up being the go-to as a come down, as a supplement to opiates. For someone who's a stimulant user, they'd probably much more seek out street Xanax or street Valium as their substitute rather than the pregabs. It really highlights how sad it is that we don't have as many international conferences where all the drugs workers can get together and talk about drugs for a long time, because it's kind of all these conversations, the ones that everyone used to have, and we haven't had them for ages. It's really nice. If anybody else wants to chip in, feel free. Florian, what happens next in terms of the resources, and what's the process now?
Yeah, so I spotted, I think we both spotted 2-3 typos, but what you call it, I think we're going to release them today, or what we can do anyway is anyone who registered, we can send out an email with the video and with the resources in the next couple of days. And I believe we're going to have another webinar in January sometime, so we can invite people to that webinar too. And if you have any comments on the resources in between, we can also just adjust them and just update them as we go.
Okay.
But yeah, thank you very much to the Robert Carr Fund who funded this. And thank you, Kevin, for working with us on this. You've worked with us in a few different things. And I would recommend Kevin he does a number of different trainings and workshops, and so I would check out his website, KFX Consulting. I don't know if you want.
It needs a bit of an update, to be honest, Florian. I wouldn't look at it until I've had a chance to tidy it up over Christmas, because it's a bit of a mess at the moment.
But it has a lot of it. It has a lot of his resources, which are wide ranging from homelessness to mental health to sexual health has quite a big range of stuff. And if you want him to do any sort of training, you can just contact him, and the email is there, and we can send out the email too with the things.
Thank you.
No problem. And thank you very much to Ruby and Carolina and all of you who have attended. And if you have any thoughts on how to improve, or if there's any sort of suggestions or some of the projects like Rana suggested, please just contact us.
Really appreciate all your involvement, and especially on a Friday evening, giving up your time for I don't know what time is where everyone else is, but for me it's a Friday evening. So thank you so much, everyone. Please do drop me an email if you've got any questions or anything you want to pick back up on. I'm really happy to have a chat with anyone. And again, thanks for Florian and Youth Rise for organising this. It's been absolutely lovely.